Good afternoon, everyone. Are we all online? Victoria? Victoria, are we online?
Moses is there with the...
Moses? I don't think so. Are we on? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah.
I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay, good. Yeah. Victoria is there. Okay, who else is there? Is Michael there? No.
Michael's on leave.
Michael's on leave, yeah. Okay, so I'll have to use you as a base, or somebody can coordinate. Durban?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear me, okay.
Can you hear me?
I
Hi,
can hear
Seeraj.
And we have two from Rhodes University. Can you hear us there, Nikki and David?
Yes, you can hear you perfectly.
And Paul Elizabeth?
No.
No. Okay, so let's start. We can, other people will join us as they come through. So I just want to introduce Professor Seeraj Mohamed. As you know, this is the BRICS Seminar Series is a series that's organized in conjunction with the South African BRICS think tank, which is hosted now by the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. I believe we may have somebody from the National Institute. There's Prof Godfrey there. No, we're not sure. Is anybody from the National Institute there either? No? Okay, perhaps they will join us. The series is being, as all the HSRC seminar series, being co-sponsored by the Department of Science and Technology. So Professor Mohamed is the Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Western Cape. He is a council member of the Human Resource Development Council of South Africa and is on the board of the Society Work and Development Institute at Wits University. He has more than 20 years of experience on economic development, research, and policy making in South Africa. He worked in the Industrial Strategy Policy Project and the Macroeconomic Research Group in the early 1990s. That's where I initially met him. He was the Director of Corporate Strategy and Industrial Development Research Program at WITS from 2006 to 2014 and was Special Advisor to the Minister of Trade and Industry, Dr. Davis, from 2009 to 14. This paper that Professor Mohamed delivered was delivered at the BRICS Academic Forum. He has since updated it, and he's going to give us a sense of what some of the issues are that we need to think about in terms of the drivers of BRICS economic cooperation. And as we all know, today many of the BRICS countries, especially the emerging ones like Brazil and South Africa, and other emerging economies are coming under extreme pressure with respect to how they should undertake cooperation, etc., because of the financial way the financial markets operate internationally currently. And some of the issues that have been raised in the crisis are corporate restructuring and global value chains, which Professor Mohamed will talk to. So it's up to you, Seeraj. Welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Jaya. Thank you, everybody, for being here by Skype and video conferencing and also in person. Yes, and I'm very happy to be doing this presentation and hopefully to be getting some feedback on the paper from colleagues here. And one of the reasons I did this paper was because there's so much hype around global value chains. There's a discussion that global value chains are sort of 80% of global trade, and that if you're a developing country and you're not getting involved in global chains, then there's no hope for you to develop, and you have to be a sort of a guide that Minister of Trade and Industry, Dr. Rob Davies, made a comment that he felt that certain interest groups in the WTO were pushing a global value chain agenda as a way to get around dealing with the push from developing countries for the Doha round to be a developmental round. And so basically to bypass that whole debate and the struggles that developing countries have done, and to say, developing countries' only option now is to unilaterally liberalize and through that get into value chains, and then they can actually start developing. Now, the work that I've been doing in the past has been about understanding global corporate structure, and especially our South African corporate structure changed, and South African companies have tried to multinationalize or internationalize, and understanding the role of finance and financialization within that, especially looking at the financialization of the South African economy, and also the financialization of South African corporations. And I mean, going through the literature, 2013, for instance, was a really good year for global value chain data and literature. There are a huge number of projects looking at global input-output and value-added calculations from JETRO in Japan. There's a consortium of European universities with huge funding from UN. The WTO is now linked up with what JETRO is doing. A few other places where there's a huge amount of data and a lot of technical information about trade, where value chains are operating within different sectors, how they operate, where the opportunities are for developing countries. But a lot of this literature actually doesn't take into account power relations, and also it doesn't actually take into account the huge changes that financialization has made to the world. So this whole globalization project since the 1980s hasn't been a neutral, value-free process. There are power relations, there's a global division of labor that, to me, seems to have become more entrenched. I think I should probably move on to my slides now. So the paper is arguing for cooperation by BRICS countries so that their corporations can assert more power in global markets through controlling and or asserting more influence over the governance of global value chains, also setting up new global value chains where they can assert control. And in response to the way in which most global value chains and global markets have become concentrated around specific value chains as a mode of organization. So the argument is that neoliberal globalization has made it harder for developing countries to assert power over governance and take the lead in global value chains, and that the BRICS countries with their sizable markets and large corporations could cooperate to try to change this global balance of power in global value chains. So, here we go. Now, starting off with this idea of what, in my introductory comments, is that what has neoliberal globalization been associated with? One is we saw massive global corporate restructuring, something Peter Nolan often refers to as a global business revolution, with a huge concentration of global markets, and that can be seen in the huge number and unprecedented number of mergers and acquisitions in the 1990s or from the 1990s. With that, the reorganization of global markets along global value chains. So movement from concentration from countries and regions towards global concentration of markets. Increased global market concentration, but not only for final goods, but intermediate and primary products, so through the value chain organization. And then, as I was saying earlier, what's left out of a lot of these discussions is the role of finance and the financialization of non-financial corporations that influence the character of global corporate restructuring and the shape of many global value chains. And now, by financialization, I'm referring to a term that became popular sort of in the 2000s. It was coined a bit earlier, but I think especially from 2000 onwards, heterodox economists have spoken about the increasing role and influence of finance within countries and globally, but also over our everyday lives, over how corporations and businesses operate, etc., as financialization. Now, the financialization of non-financial corporations has as one aspect of it has been that non-financial corporations are now involved in more financial activities that contribute a larger share to their incomes and their profits. And a lot of those activities include speculation in financial markets. Over the weekend, I think, or maybe on Monday, there was an article in one of the local papers about how South African companies are sitting on a huge amount of savings. And in fact, that's been something that's been happening for quite a while, and hopefully a few people in the media are noticing it now. But that's, I think, partly related to this financialization process. And in fact, work that we did at BRICS showed that, you know, non-financial corporations in South Africa from the 80s, when they were apartheid isolation, started becoming more financialized, and it could have been linked to the political situation and the isolation at the time, but they were sitting on much more liquid assets, and they were by 2007, we see that net acquisition of financial assets is 2.5 times fixed investment by non-financial corporations in South Africa. And what happened from the 80s through the 90s into the 2000s is that they've actually moved from short-term to shorter-term financial assets. And if anybody's interested, I can forward you some of the research we did related to that. Now, the result of this neoliberal globalization and financialization has led to increased control of global value chains and global markets by developed country corporations that has exacerbated the global division of labor, where developing countries largely remain providers of primary inputs and cheap assembly of manufactured products. Developed countries control intellectual property and designing, engineering, branding, and global distribution of products. Developed country financial markets and rentiers influence governance and distribution of income within global value chains and global markets. And it's become harder for developing country corporations to become lead corporations within global value chains and/or to influence the governance of global value chains. Now, as I was saying earlier, the mainstream perspective on global value chains, I'll read this quote from a paper by Gereffi and Fernandez, is that the global economy is increasingly structured around global value chains that account for a rising share of international trade, global GDP, and employment. GVCs link firms, workers, and consumers around the world and often provide a stepping stone for firms and workers in developing countries to integrate into the global economy. They do add in this discussion that the way in which developing countries can benefit from this depend on actions taken in developing countries to make sure that they actually move up the value chain, do more training, get more technology, etc. So there's a huge rider to this, but there is basically within this kind of literature, and coming from, if you look at the OECD report in 2013, the World Trade Organization reports in 2013 as well, and even to some extent UNCTAD, even though UNCTAD takes a more nuanced view on this, as they do on most issues, compared to the OECD or the WTO. There's this idea that if developing countries want to be in the game, they have to be in global value chains. Now, I argue that this view doesn't adequately take into account the power relations in the global economy that have shaped the power and governance of global value chains. So the paper describes a shift in the structure of global markets that influence global corporate structure. The focus is on two important developments in global product and financial markets. One is a shift during the post-World War II period from oligopoly accommodation to increasingly competitive global markets, financialization of many economies, the shareholder value revolution, and financialization of non-financial corporations. So there's a sort of a shift on the product and financial markets, and it's in the context of neoliberal globalization with widespread adoption of contractionary economic policies, trade and financial liberalization, and a shift to supply-side trickle-down economics. So we enter into a period like the 80s, where the major goal of macroeconomic policy in most of the developed countries and many developing countries adopt neoliberal type Washington consensus type policies, and the goal of macro policy changes from full employment towards fighting inflation. So you basically get a contractionary supply side perspective, push for integrating trade and financial markets. And this widespread shift in the way macro policy is done, with moving away from a focus on aggregate demand, has a huge impact on the global aggregate demand and global GDP. And in fact, the post-Second World War period up to the late 70s, we see across the globe and within regions, including Africa, GDP is higher in that post-Second World War period in real terms than in the period from the 80s to the present. There's work by people like Andre Cornea and others, Andre Cornea from the World Bank and others, sort of looking at these differences. So I won't go into that further. So the argument is that large corporations, especially from the north, but are affected by these changes and also by these shifts. And so you had this period of rapid technological development, rapid growth, rapid internationalization, multinationalization of corporations in the post-Second World War period, and high profits right up to the 60s, 70s, and then you have these conditions that affect profitability. Now, the change in global competition is this change from oligopolistic competition to increasingly cutthroat competition that occurs with an increase in competition. One, it starts with the emergence of, or rebuilding of the Japan and Germany and European countries after the Second World War, that starts to sort of challenge the American dominance in that early post-Second World War period. And then from the 70s, especially in the 80s, the rise of developing country manufacturing, particularly the Asian tigers. And so you get a huge change in global product markets that moves the kind of oligopolistic types of competition and more what we could think of more cooperative competition that you had in the global economy amongst the largest corporations towards a cutthroat, or what Jim Crotty calls, drawing on the work of Schumpeter, coercive competition. And coercive competition is where corporations in core industries are forced to invest to remain in the game, even when profits are negative or declining because of the sunk costs. And this is where a heterodox economic analysis is different to a mainstream economic analysis, because it actually recognizes the irreversibility of investment. And the fact that once you've made a large investment within your business, it's often hard to change that, or to sell it and to recoup all of that. And so we see many of the largest corporations, when their profits are down, basically fighting harder, investing more, and a lot of that investment had come from retained earnings, and now we're seeing them having to turn to financial markets. Now, the result of this competition is increased dependence on financial markets to finance the coerced investment, because competition destroyed profits. And through one is having lower retained earnings for firms to actually maintain profits, and also lower technology rents. And what happens is, as competition increases, firms have to bring in to market new technology and innovations much faster. So they're less able to draw out the period between bringing in new products and the technology and innovation rents they can draw from those products over that period, to the point where today we're seeing, every 6 months or so, people are bringing new cell phone models onto the market. And basically the business media spends a huge amount of its space and airtime telling us about what the new Samsung or Apple phones will look like, and their leaks, and sort of being concerned that Apple's for the first time facing lower demand for new phones, etc. Now, there's also been with this shift, there's been a move by larger players to reassert control over global markets through mergers and acquisitions. And as I said, the 1990s was a period of unprecedented levels of mergers and acquisitions globally. And in some of my older papers, in 2010-11, if people are interested, I've actually got graphs showing that South African mergers and acquisitions seem to track global mergers and acquisitions, with, for a short period, actually increased foreigners getting involved in South African mergers and acquisitions as well. The other thing that happens is that the attempts to lower costs through downsizing, outsourcing, and offshoring, and within this we see a larger role for the ways in which global value chains operate and are governed. Now, coming back to the financialization of non-financial corporations, we see that many studies sort of showing that there's been non-financial financialization of non-financial corporations in many countries, and I think this fact has become recognized within mainstream business in South Africa. If you look at Ernst & Young reports looking at the rise of shareholder value movement in South Africa, for instance, reported in their mergers and acquisitions publications from the early 2000s, you actually start seeing that recognition even in, in sort of reports and books coming out from business. A larger share of the income and profits of non-financial corporations now derive from financial activities and speculation in financial markets. And we see that the shareholder value movement, which we can think of basically representing mostly large institutional investors that take large shares in many of these corporations, pushing them getting higher short-term returns, and also aligning the interests of management and executives through use of things like stock options and linking remuneration of executives to profitability. That we've seen sort of a change in the behavior of these non-financial corporations. With now, I argue, drawing on work, especially from US economists who've been doing work on non-financial corporations on financial markets, on NFC, of financialization of NFCs, is basically saying that the dependence of NFCs on financial markets for investment as a result of coercive competition was an important reason for their financialization. This dependence happened at the time when there was a rise of the shareholder value movement and greater control over corporate governance from financiers. People like Lazonic talk about shareholder value as a new ideology for corporate governance, and especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. Now, the shareholder value movement demanded increased shareholder value and achieved this through pushing corporations to focus on short-term returns rather than long-term growth, and to increase short-term returns through layoffs, outsourcing, and casualization. Lazonic and O'Sullivan in a 2001 paper described this as a shift from retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute. The realignment of executive interests with shareholder interests to increase short-term financial returns through stock options and other incentives for executives. Increased focus on core business and global brands, and increasing global market share and increasing control of global value chains. So we see with the rise of the shareholder value movement and the influence over how corporations operate, we see them pushing certain things that they're interested in. In South Africa, especially if you look at a corporation like Anglo American, the big push from once they moved their primary listing to London, and the shareholder value movement had more control over them, there was a big push for them to actually simplify their structure, to move away from cross-holdings, pyramid structures, etc. And there was also a push for them to focus on their core business. In fact, there was a response when Traha was CEO of Anglo to the people from the shareholder value movement to say, you know, Anglo will decide what is its core business based on where they see their profits coming from. And this was sort of 98, soon after the primary listing in London. And by 2000, Anglo was actually singing the song and saying we are committed to increasing shareholder value and focusing on core business. And if you read Anglo's annual reports, the CEO and the chair, you know, within the first few lines, those words appear consistently. Increasing shareholder value, focusing on core business, to the point where Anglo is now seeing themselves as a mining company focused on 7 or 8 mined products, and they also starting to define core as also linked to certain countries that they get involved in. So we're seeing these kind of just using Anglo as an example, you can see the huge influence, and this influence actually extends into how global value chains operate and are governed. And a paper by William Mohlberg, I forget the year now, probably 2007 or 8, maybe earlier. He basically argues that, you know, what's happened in the US is that even though there's been a huge amount of outsourcing and offshoring, their businesses moving operations to produce in China and other countries, the shareholders are still able to extract most of the high returns that these firms make, and the actual structure and the way in which they govern value chains it helps with basically squeezing the value chain to increase the returns that go to the financial financiers, the rentiers that invest in these corporations, or the lead corporations in the global value chains. And most of them remain, or I should say almost all of them remain within countries like the US and the developed countries. Now, when thinking about what's happened with developing countries and their multinationalization, I draw on work that people at the OECD Research Center done, especially Andre Goldstein. And they talk about 2 waves of multinationalization of developing country corporations. The first wave occurred in the 70s, particularly from successful Asian tiger countries. And this first wave of developing country multinational enterprise internationalization or multinational corporate multinationalization was similar to those of developed country M&Es through trade or FDI in response to trade barriers. But unlike the second wave, the first wave did not happen because of outsourcing and offshoring from developed countries. The second wave was a more integrated and occurred in a more integrated and concentrated global economy. The control, concentration, and interfirm influence occurred through global value chains. Now, there's a quote from Froud and several other authors based at, she and most of them are based at Manchester Business School, do really good work on understanding corporate behavior, but also understanding the impact of financialization. And they illustrate the difference between the first and second waves of multinational enterprise growth and include the impact of financialization on the second wave. They don't use a sort of an Asian tiger. They use Japan as an example, but you can insert South Korea or another country there if you want. I'll read this long quote. It says, when the Japanese sold cars in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, the contest was a productionist one between compact, nationally enclosed supply chains in Japan and Detroit, with lower wages sustaining Japanese advantage, so that firms like Toyota could reinvest profits and grow market shares. They built their own brands. The position in the 2000s is complicated by financialization and long trans-Pacific supply chains, where power is often wielded by US firms which act as proxies for the stock market and boost profits by multiple tactics, which include control of design, consumer marketing, and the use of contract power to take profits at the expense of margins in the Chinese suppliers. Froud and others have got a good paper on looking at the Apple business model, for example, where they look at Foxconn. I don't know how many of you know Foxconn. It's a huge corporation. I think it probably has about 250,000 workers, and they assemble all your cell phones basically. They do it for most of the big cell phone companies, and what we're seeing is that Foxconn, if they were involved in that first wave of multinationalization, we've been producing their own brand, would be an original equipment manufacturer, or original brand manufacturer. Instead, given the way in which the value chains are governed now and the role of financialization in shaping how they've structured, Foxconn remains in the business and actually grows in the business of being a cell phone producer. And one of the impacts of that is that Foxconn recently, or actually over the last few years, we've seen them being squeezed more and more as, for instance, people buy Apple phones or products, start pushing Apple to start taking more concern with the environment, with how workers are treated, etc. Apple basically goes to companies like Foxconn and says, fix things up, but they don't actually share in the cost of that. And Foxconn seems to have absorbed most of the cost of that. Their profits have been down. They're not, in terms of the financials, they're not performing that well. But Apple's financials have been great over the last few years, and they basically kept their consumers happy. So we're seeing these kind of relations play out within global value chains and the power that lead corporations from developed countries have. Now, in South Africa, financialization of non-financial corporations, as in other countries, has been associated with deindustrialization. In some earlier papers, I argue that this financialization of the economy has made South Africa more reliant on mining and minerals. Therefore, within the global value chains and the global division of labor, South Africa's place is one of providing raw material inputs. I argue that if South Africa were to partner with other BRICS partners to set up alternative value chains, we could possibly develop successful programs to reverse deindustrialization and deepen and diversify its industrial base. The argument basically that it's in our interest as BRICS countries to cooperate and to respond to the way in which global value chains have been governed, have been structured, and where they often represent the interest of financial interests, especially from developed countries, and to move towards that with a stronger focus on development. Now, that's my last slide, and I've been told I've got 5 minutes left. I just want to end off saying that there's a lot of room to be skeptical about multinational corporations, especially ones from countries like South Africa, but you look at the ones from China, Russia, etc., there are big questions about whether they could be part of a progressive developmental change, or whether they sort of sub-imperialist powers and they part of a process whereby global capital, in order to keep accumulating, is basically coming back to countries in Africa and other developing countries. Sorry, did I do that? I did. And basically squeezing us, and so BRICS becomes for a lot of people the vanguard of this process, and we should oppose BRICS. There's a recent book, edited volume with Patrick Bond is one of the editors, where they've got, I think, quite a lot of convincing arguments along these lines, and I think it's something that we involved in the BRICS Academic Forum and the BRICS think tank should take seriously, and to consider our role hopefully as progressive academics and thinkers and people who do research on financial markets, on corporations, to think through, what do we want from BRICS, and how can we forward that agenda? And personally, I haven't given up on the idea that BRICS could be a force for positive change, but to be actually do that with a huge amount of soberness and skepticism, just looking at the way in which South African large corporations behave in the rest of Africa, for instance. Often South Africa is seen as sort of the gateway for the rest of BRICS into the continent. So I'm going to end off there saying I see an opportunity. I see hopefully a way to think about global value chains differently, to think about financialization and governance and power relations within that, and to think about whether we see ability to change things with BRICS. Thank you very much for this chance to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Seeraj. Just to inform all of you that this seminar is being streamed live on YouTube. So we got our partners in India, in China, in Russia, and Brazil will be following these issues. And they probably send comments through by Twitter feed, which we may have to send to you to answer. Okay, so and so when we are done, I'd like you to be able to say to your name and your organization when you pose your questions, so that we have a sense of who's here. We know that there's a list going around to register your names, etc., so that we know who's here, and you then, if you haven't been on our list before, you will be on our list for future seminars and workshops. You can also visit the bricsresearch.org.za, check out some of the working papers. This will go on as one of the working papers. It's also been published in the BRICS Academic, 7th BRICS Academic Forum book that was put out by Russia. But we'll also have a list of future papers that will be a working paper series in the brics.org.za. So we'll also have links with other websites, including the South African BRICS think tank website and Indian BRICS think tank councils, and from Russia and China and from Brazil. So the floor is open for your discussions. We have about 25 minutes. And then there's sandwiches that you may be able to share and participate. I hope there's
virtual sandwiches.
Virtual sandwiches. We can send it through to you. But let me open up for discussion. So we'll start off with Pretoria, go to Durban, and then Nikki and David, if you're still online.
Can we start maybe with David, because
okay, okay, we'll start with the Skype people, and then in case they lose out, and then we will come to Pretoria, and then to Durban, and then last to Cape Town. So, David?
Thank you very much.
I don't know if we can hear you. Can you speak up?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have to go into a seminar just now, so I just wanted to say thanks very much, Seeraj. That was very, I think it's a very useful and succinct approach. My only question is really whether the YouTube will be available, that we can, because I'd love to show it to my students.
Yes, we should be able to share that link with you. It's currently streaming live now, though, so you could actually get that. Won't be a problem.
Okay.
Can I say hi, Bill? Sorry.
Sorry, Nikki, just hold on a second. Seeraj wants to say hi to somebody.
I just saw Bill. I was so busy reading my slides, I missed you coming in. It's great to see you, Bill.
Okay, this is Me too. Old Boys Network. Okay, Nikki.
sorry, can you hear me over there?
Yes.
Just speak up louder so the others can pick you up too.
All right. Thanks very much, Seeraj. I just wanted to ask about what you think about possible policy responses in the light of what you've discussed in the paper. So, for example, just in terms of, what policy space does this leave for developing countries, particularly in terms of industrial policy? How do you do industrial policy in this kind of era of global value chains and the way that this global corporate restructuring has taken place? And I just, something that just struck me from a workshop I recently went to, where, I raised the issue about just to do with trade agreements. And they were talking about how trade agreements are supposed to create a level playing field. So I raised this issue about the balance of power and how you can't have a level playing field when you don't have when there's such a skewed balance of power. And the response was, well, use competition policy, in the face of these powerful multinational corporations. Developing countries can have a competition policy to control things and make sure they get enough policy space. I just wondered what your response was to that.
Okay, you can answer. Let's take a few more questions. Are there any questions from Durban?
Yes, I was going to say, Seeraj, how the parallel between this is so striking to what goes on within specific countries in terms of shedding core, non-core functions, and in a sense putting the risk on contract firms at various levels of specialization. The paper I'm doing with Nicola on labor makes it so stark and so clear. So I like this idea of this on the macro level, but it isn't just international, it's at every level. And I think it ties in to power, and I think it ties into financialization. But what I wanted to say to you and see what you think is this. I mean, if you really had BRICS playing this role, getting involved in this, wouldn't BRICS just become another financialized center? And what would that say about, for example, other African countries? How would we be operating vis-a-vis them? In other words, are we talking about creating a rival financialized hierarchy, or are we talking about something that would fundamentally disrupt this whole pattern which you capture, which is so powerful in terms of where capitalism is going?
Okay, thank you. From Pretoria.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, any questions from Pretoria?
It doesn't seem to be anything at the moment.
I have a question.
Oh, you got one.
Yeah. My name is Charles Parkinson. I'm from Salga. I'm just wondering, is there a role, you mentioned our part of our value chain is sort of in commodities and the extractive industries and commodity based, and obviously where we play within that global value chain. But I was wondering, whether there's a role for sort of economic regions and functional city regions. Is there a role in our territorialism, in other words? Is there a role for these economic regions in supporting what you're advocating for? In other words, reshift or shifting power, shifting competitiveness, shifting our control, the governance of these value chains, is there a role, in other words, for these economic regions, and whether they be city regions or commodity-based regions?
Okay, thank you. From Cape Town? Are there any questions from Cape Town? Yeah.
I mean, I agree.
Just identify yourself.
Sorry, Mario Jacobs. I'm a researcher at the Labour and Enterprise Policy Research Group at UCT. Current trade data between BRICS countries, and in particular, I would want to make the example of South Africa and Brazil, is minimal. I think, aside from what we all accept as the political almost similarities between Brazil and South Africa, Brazil does not have a national capitalist class. There's no national capital that exists within Brazil other than foreign investors with large-scale investment that has not really played a significant part over the last...
the brilliant Brazilian state.
Sure.
And so the Brazilian mining companies.
Sure. So much of investment, infrastructural investment or development in Brazil has been driven by state enterprises. And then over the last 2 years, we've had a scandal with Petrobras, and that has obviously spiraled into other state-owned enterprises, which is effectively creating a situation where there's no real economic development in Brazil at the current period. Whether that may have given rise to the impeachment, etc., that's another debate. In South Africa, we have similar forms of situations where South African capital effectively has gone into Southern Africa or into the rest of Africa to maximize profit margins. So you are correct to point out that there's not been capital investment into current operations, which created problems of unemployment, inequality, etc., etc. I mean, how do you see, in the example of Brazil and South Africa, the forging of global value chains or value chains of any means, if the policy perspectives of those two countries, as an example, seem to be moving in the opposite direction?
Okay, are there any questions, other questions here from Cape Town? No? Okay, we'll go for a second round if necessary, and in the meantime, you can answer this, Seeraj.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone, for those questions. They're really hard questions, so I'm probably going to leave a lot of it unanswered and see sort of what I can contribute to them. Just the last question by Mario, and I think there's a bit of overlap with what Nikki's question is. Nikki's question was about possible policy responses, policy space for developing countries, and also the use of competition policy. And Mario's question is related to basically where there's not that much trade between countries like Brazil and South Africa, for instance, and there seems to be a policy divergence between those countries. So what's the room for cooperation? So I mean, my answer is to say that in the role that the BRICS countries play and the different fora within the BRICS, those between business and finance and those between communities, academics, etc., there needs to be sort of, I think, a consciousness built around the fact that we live in a world that has been shaped by a specific kind of history, and that neoliberal globalization and financialization has had an impact on that, and that the relations between businesses from different parts of the world are often not happening on a level playing field, on an equal basis, that is a power relation, and that we need to think about what we can do to adjust that power relation. I mean, coming to sort of think about then, is competition policy an answer? And I would say that, competition policy seems to be exactly the wrong answer. And that you need to actually be supportive of building large corporations who can end up being really dominant in your markets, but in a way that's where the state plays a huge role, hopefully, in working with, partnering, and hopefully regulating those large corporations to be successful within either existing value chains or new value chains, and that cooperation between BRICS multinational corporations and the states of the BRICS countries, who often play a large economic role, direct economic role as owners of enterprises. I mean, this whole separation between the state and the market is a really a wrong way to be looking at things in this situation, and especially with the Chinese, the Russians, and Brazil and us, and also still within India, the state as a real direct economic player, and building state cooperation to think through how they can change power relations in markets and value chains, I think is hugely important. And so when thinking through trade agreements, and I said, even within the WTO, they're sort of saying, well, the global value chains are the only game in town now. There's a recognition that trade is actually not happening in a free market between equal players. Trade is happening, most trade is happening within global value chains. It's not happening at an arm's length. the relationships between players and countries that is no longer a sort of how I think the basis for the rhetoric and the ideology of the WTO. And so there's I think the WTO is probably facing a bit of a crisis issue and trying to think through what that means. The initial public response is to say, well, free up trade, because that's how you're going to get involved in global value chains. I think there's a much larger project here. And reading the 2013 book with all its data and the technical analysis, I think there's a room for them to actually have a serious rethink about what trade agreements can look like in the future. I mean, if you think about the auto producers, companies like Ford or Toyota or VW, the relationship with their suppliers is such a close one where they actually supply engineers. They work with them in their workshops when they produce the components. They help them on the procurement side and on the supply side. The barriers between what we think of as firms are now, not there anymore. The only reason why they may be different firms is that they've got legally different shareholders and they've been incorporated as separate firms. But to a large extent, you can think of these as sort of basically Toyota firms, so, or Volkswagen firms within global value chains. Some of the stuff I looked at the time when Massmart was being bought up by Walmart, there were reports from Senate hearings in the US where there were complaints by suppliers to Walmart in the US that they didn't want to move to China. They wanted to maintain their family businesses and maintain production within the US. And basically, the relationship with Walmart was one that totally changed what they did, the nature of their company, to the point where they actually didn't have a say in where they were located, right? And so in thinking about what trade and the rhetoric and the ideology of trade policy and the approach to trade, I think is a huge thing. And I think, neoliberal economists and neoclassical economists who still think about competition policy as sort of small players and driving, less market power, really need a reality check. Now, in terms of, how positive I am that countries like South Africa and Brazil can work together, that's another thing. I mean, given our own problems, that's the first problem. The second one is that we all have our existing roles in value chains and relationships. Our countries actually, the things we export, mostly the minerals products, don't need a huge amount of imported. It's mostly domestically supplied, but the things that we export do play roles in value chains. So that puts us in specific relationships to the different value chains. The thing is, within the BRICS, especially in China, there are countries that play much larger roles in many different value chains. And how do we as Brazil and South Africa relate to their producers and their attempts to, for instance, become lead corporations within global value chains and what they do. So I think there's a huge amount of work and thinking and research, and I think there's a huge amount of data to support that kind of work. And being involved in the BRICS Academic Forum and think tank may be one avenue for pursuing that kind of work, and maybe cooperation as well, and to use the other fora within the BRICS to build that. But I agree, it's especially given conditions now for commodity producers and countries that have problems with corruption, political corruption at the political level anyway. I think it's really a bad time to think about anything else. Hopefully this will pass. In terms of regions, I mean, that's a difficult one, and it's something that I struggle with. It's interesting if you look at business school fads. The big thing, I think, probably in the 80s was Porter and clusters and these agglomeration economies, and then suddenly, everybody was talking about global value chains, and it didn't matter where these firms were located; they could all work within one global value chain in the production of commodities. And it seems that we can't totally write off the whole agglomeration economies literature, and I mean it's clear that that regions and especially city regions still play a huge role within economies and also within their firms within global value chains. So I'm going to sort of say this is something I really need to think much more about, I mean I'm sure you can get my email address and we could maybe communicate some more about this by email. But I don't know, it's something that at the moment I could really answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Seeraj. I'm not sure whether there are any other
I'm sorry,
questions.
Bill's question.
Yeah, Bill,
I mean,
I was just
sorry,
saying.
just Bill, I was, I ended off with sort of this discussion about sub-imperialism and the squeezing of basically within countries, and especially what South African companies are doing in the rest of Africa, but also countries, companies like Vale in Brazil, what they've been doing in Mozambique, and this, I mean, and there's all the fear about the role that China will be playing in Africa. So, and your point that what we're seeing happening on a micro level is sort of also being reflected at the macro level, I think, is true. It's actually a very good point to make, and so that raises questions about can we shift and change the behaviors, and can we, through either the state being an active economic player or through regulation, reduce the power of finance and the motives that finance brings to corporations to push for short-term high returns that ends up actually causing more squeezing, and rather thinking about looking just at short-term high rates of return rather than a long-term developmental project. Think through how to reverse that financialization, the impact of that financialization, and I think that's a broader economic and political issue and agenda, and that's linked to the role that finance plays in the economy, how finance is regulated, the level to which the state provides for people's pensions, for people's health insurance, for education. I mean, all those aspects have been supporting financialization of everyday life, but it's also built up institutional investors to the point where they can be so powerful, where they basically take money from us every month and can decide what they want to do with it, where they want to put it, and that gives them a huge amount of influence. And so, with states possibly playing a more developmental and welfare role, we could possibly reduce some of that impact of financialization at the domestic, local level, but also hopefully at the global level, and getting power back from finances, and hopefully being able to regulate the non-financial corporations to behave as well.
Thank you. Just to comment on the issue of regionalization from the chair's position, I think one of the big issues on that has been the competition between regions and cities to promote what's called these economic zones. The economic zone issue has been raised as a success story in some countries and other countries, and I think in South Africa, because of the way in which our tax system operates, it's a bit more difficult to do that. But I think, again, as Seeraj is saying, perhaps issues around regulation using tax and other policy instruments may provide the basis for looking at how this can promote at one level and also regulate at another level the regions and the cities, etc. In South Africa, we have this intergovernmental fiscal relations system, which tends to regulate how things happen. So that may be one issue. On the issue of the way in which China builds a question. I think you've covered much of the issues and the concerns that people have around that. But I think today we are seeing almost concerted attack on BRICS through the financial system, international financial system. And I think many of the BRICS countries don't have the counterpart power to be able to counteract some of that. And even China is under attack through the financial system. And I guess in August sometime this year, the renminbi may become an international reserve currency. Would be, I think it's only, currently it's only second to the US